This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad. You on a delay?
I'm on a delay.
Sounds
already?
Like
already? Are we on a delay?
We're out of sync. Yep.
Okay. Well, yeah, had a good week. I put a post on LinkedIn today, and it might be a little while before this episode airs, but I got a lot of great feedback from listeners, and I love our listeners, man. They gave a lot of good ideas for show episodes and show topics they'd like to hear more about. So real quickly, the list at a high level was ITDR, roles. I got like 7 different DMs about, roles in one way or another. Blockchain identity, IGA for the middle market, vault dynamic roles, which was essentially like Secrets Vault, how to, use leading practices for not hard coding accounts into your scripts and using them for your databases and things like that. Machine identity.
But how am I supposed to grab your password if you don't have it hard coded in your script? You're not making it any easier for me.
I'm not making it easier. That's the goal here. Machine identities, and here's an interesting one: NIST or CISA's view on identity's role in security. So kind of getting that security view of, okay, we all think identity is at the center, but do these folks who are more broadly information security, do they see it the same way? What's their viewpoint? And then a couple that I just lumped in as project success stories, but some of these are going to blow your mind. If we actually can pull together episodes on these are like projects that you've actually heard of on TV. Like, I know you don't have TV, you have like streaming services, but you may have heard of some of them.
Yeah, okay. I'm interested to see what you've got cooked up for here. I'm not sure if I know all the different topics that you're thinking about, which is sort of how it works, right? You're kind of like the public outreach and kind of figuring out, where content, and then I'm like the massage behind that to get it into hopefully a audio friendly format.
I don't know if your job's gotten easier. Mine's gotten easier. I know in the beginning I was like trying to convince people like, oh, hey, our podcast has had these 2 people that you've heard of on it before, so maybe you'd like to join us as well. And now it's gotten to the point where people are reaching out to me much more often. And when I, approach somebody, usually I don't have to explain what our podcast is about because they're aware of it, which is actually pretty cool.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. Definitely off the backs of the best identity and access management podcast listeners in the business. If I can qualify that so much down to just that narrow niche market of people who are in identity and access management who also listen to podcasts, we have the best ones. That's for sure.
Your objective rating is that our listeners are the best.
Yes,
got it.
100%. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what comes up out of some of these conversations. There are some interesting things that are being worked out there. I like having conversations with real people in the real world and really kind of understanding what it is they work on and some of the challenges they face. Because I think one does a couple things, right? Shows that it's not just theory. These are actually things that take place in the real world, not on a piece of paper. And people aren't alone, right? They're facing challenges, and maybe some of those challenges draw parallels to some of the work that people are doing in their own IAM lives. And maybe there's some nuggets there that they can take back to help improve their own IAM capabilities or services or program or whatever it may be. So I do like those kind of conversations where you can kind of pick the brain and say, oh, how'd that work? What were some of the challenges he had? And what about this? Have you seen that? And, those kinds of things. So I do enjoy those.
Yeah, I don't know what the statistics are in these days, but I know 10, 15 years ago, we used to talk about why IAM projects fail, and they were failing at like a 50% clip. And I just don't think that the failure rate is that high anymore. And I think, there were probably a lot of factors, right? We, in fact, had a blog article that you and I worked on reasons that IAM projects failed. I don't think they're as prevalent as they were in the past, but I still think there's so much to learn from those success stories, and it's really leaders, figuring out ways to overcome these challenges like you talked about.
I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if they're getting more successful or if it's becoming so important that it just can't fail. Meaning the quality of the end result maybe isn't what people expected. Because identity is so important, can it fail? Yes, of course. Can you have a bad deployment, a bad rollout, of whatever it is? Absolutely. And I think that happens probably with still regularity, unfortunately. I think it has gotten better, but I don't know if I agree that it's become more prevalent, at least from my perspective. We actually have two different, opinions on it at this point, but I don't know if it's gotten easier. I think maybe people are settling for a less desirable end product as part of a deployment or a program, or they had to spend way more money and time than they originally forecasted to get something out the door because it was more complex, or they ran into other headwinds, whether it be economy, COVID, probably wrecked a lot of things like that.
Yeah, I wonder if IAM practitioners are running into some less resistance on certain things. Like 15, 20 years ago, saying, here's the idea. We're going to have one username and password and it's going to log into all of your applications.
You're crazy.
There might have been people like, that's not going to work here.
You're crazy.
Like nowadays you can say, no, it works everywhere. Everybody's doing it. We're going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's just kind of scratching the tip of it, though. It's like, okay, single sign-on, sure. MFA, we saw a lot more uptake with that, especially with COVID. People working from home. It's like, okay, everybody who was really kicking the MFA can down the curb kind of had to do something around the COVID times for the most part. And then now you still have like basics, identity governance, privilege access. You still have things out there on the authentication side of things. You got passkeys now, passwordless, and other things. I don't know. Now, I will qualify my opinion as being jaded somewhat, only because, and I think I've said this before, is like you don't call an IAM consultant when things are going great, typically. It's usually when things are not going as well, or you need help or advice or something. So we tend to see the things that are not going well. I'm sure that there are plenty that are, and maybe that's my own personal experience.
No, that's great. And I think one of the great times to talk about all this and learn about all this, obviously the podcast, but there's also some great conferences that are taking place. It seems like there are more identity conferences these days than there were in the past. We're going to be taking part in a few of them. You want to kind of talk through some of the ones that you're going to attend, and I'll talk about a few as well.
Yeah, I think the next one coming up for me is the Cybersecurity Midwest Summit. That's the one in Cincinnati, Ohio. It is September 14th. It's something that ComSpark and CDO Magazine put out there, something you do every year. I'm going to be part of a panel discussing identity and access management. I started working on sort of the outline for it last week and have already forgotten it, so I need to go back and review it. So there's that. So if you're going to be in the Cincinnati area, feel free to stop on by. I'm not sure if it costs anything. It might actually be free. Don't quote me on that. But we'll have a registration link for folks who are interested in that. I'm going to be at Identity Week America, October 3rd and 4th in Washington, D.C. I'm going to be hosting a panel on passkeys. So we're going to have a few different people. Some friendly names for the show will be on that as well. That one's kind of cool because we actually have a discount code for our listeners. If you use the code IDAC30, they get you 30% off of your conference pass. And for those of our folks who listen in Asia, who I know we have many out there, that code also works for Identity Week Asia. So if you can't make it to America for October 3rd and 4th in Washington, D.C., and you're in the Asia region and you can plan on hitting that one, you can use the same code IDAC30. I'll have a link to that one in our show notes as well. And we're kind of dividing and conquering that week because, Jim, you're going to be at Octane, right?
Yeah, that very same week I'll be at Octane. So that's October 3rd through 5th in San Francisco. We've got a fantastic discount code for that as well. A little weird, so I'm going to say it slowly. Okay, TNIDAC 30. That'll be in the show notes in case you missed it. It'll be 30% off. Go to okta.com/octane to register. Looking forward to that. We're going to actually co-sponsor an event. This is like breaking news, Jeff. I'm just finding out about this.
I'm not going to be there. You guys are throwing a party?
Yeah, we're throwing a party, man.
Is that
it's going to be fun. So, yeah, it'll be a good time. You and I will also be at the Authenticate conference. We've been talking a lot about this one. The discount code for this one is IDAC 15 podcast. I know there are more than one discount code out there, but on top of using our discount code, gets you 15% off, some lucky person who uses the code will get a gift basket. So that's something that the Authenticate folks have told us as well. They're going to have something. We don't know all the details of what that gift is going to be. It might just be a t-shirt, an extra small or extra large, whichever one doesn't fit you. But I have a feeling it'll be something pretty good because these guys know how to put it on a good show. That's going to be October 16th through 18th in Carlsbad, California, which is San Diego. And that's that. I think that's going to be, that's the big one for us, right, Jeff? Because we're going to be on stage during the keynote. And then on the second day, we're going to be doing a live in front of a studio audience series of podcasts. We've got 6 folks committed to doing live podcasting with us. Now, when I say live, we're not going to release the shows live. We're not going to be streaming them over the interwebs, but it'll be in front of a live studio audience, and then we'll do some kind of expedited publishing of those shows.
Yeah, taped in front of a live studio audience of, I don't know, dozens, maybe dozen. I'd be happy to get 2 or 3 people in there, pulling people away from other sessions that I feel kind of bad about. But yeah, we're going to have I guess the way we're thinking this is going to be set up is we'll have a little room. We'll be set up with our stuff, and there'll be some chairs. People can kind of, listen in. And if we got enough people, maybe we can take some questions from the audience based on different guests you got lined up and stuff like that. But yeah, it'd be kind of cool. Plus, I think you mentioned it, we're going to be on the stage, part of the keynote. That is going to be the style that we're looking at doing is like a live podcast style panel in front of the whole thing. And that one is going to be streamed on the internet. So that's the plan, which is kind of cool and a little bit nerve wracking, but we'll do it live.
Yeah. So enough about us, Jeff.
Yeah. So we'll have all these links in our show notes. Hopefully people can take advantage of all those discount codes. Very much appreciative to all the different conferences that work with us on this stuff. I think most people know at this point, we really don't do commercials and things like that. But if it's something that's vendor neutral or something that we think benefits, all of our listeners, that's something that we're always listening out for. And we're glad that folks, take us up on that. So enough with all that. Why don't we talk about sausage and how it's made for IAM standards development? That was a professional podcast segue, and I am happy to finally get on the show. I feel like this is a conversation that she and I have been standing around awkwardly in circles for, I think, maybe a year now, maybe probably even longer, where we have mutual people we know, but I don't know if we've never actually interacted in real life. I'm hoping to change that the next time we see each other. But she is Heather Flanagan. She's the principal at Spherical Cow Consulting. She's also a principal editor for the body of knowledge at ID Pro, which, hey, this podcast is part of that as well. And she a collector of many, many, many hats is probably a good way to say it as well. So welcome to the show, Heather.
Hello, Jeff. Hello, Jim.
Thanks for taking the time with us. I think, like I mentioned, this is a conversation that's been a long time coming. We've been big fans of ID Pro for a long time. I know you do a lot of work with those guys as well. One of the things that we like to get into, though, is, this is a pretty diverse field when we talk about identity and access management. There's technical resources, there's non-technical resources, and there's even everything in between, and education and all kinds of stuff, right? So tell me, how did you get into identity and access management? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
It was a natural occurrence, really. So I was supposed to be a librarian when I grew up. I don't know if you knew that. That's actually my degree, is library science. And but that was the mid 90s, and the first thing I did was work for a internet service provider that was part of a newspaper, had a public research division, and quickly came about where what they needed more than anything else was someone to manage systems, and specifically someone to make sure that whoever was accessing those systems were the right people to access. So I think anyone who gets into IT and actually manages systems directly or anything, you suddenly realize that identity management is it's a fundamental part of what you do. And since then, and that was a while ago, 1995, identity's always been a part of any role that I've ever played, either management or directly.
So we're going to talk about ID Pro here, but I have to ask you about Spherical Cow. First of all, 2 questions. One, what the heck is a spherical cow? And two, what is Spherical Cow Consulting? What do you do?
Oh my goodness, what is it and what do I do? Okay, so if you're registering a business in Washington State, you have to give it a name. And it felt really weird to have Heather Flanagan LLC, so I had to pick a name. And the reason I was forming a business is because one of my very first clients as an independent was a bunch of physicists. The Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory people, also known as LIGO, also known as those folks that won that Nobel Prize. Anyway, there's this old joke about physicists. It's such an old joke that it has its own Wikipedia entry. So I won't torture you with the joke itself. I will tell you to go look it up on Wikipedia. Just type in spherical cow and you'll get it. And but at the heart of the joke is the fact that, these physicists are taking incredibly complicated, crazy things and trying to simplify them into something that you can actually work with, which is, at the end of the day, what I do for a living. I'm working with standards development. I'm working in the identity space. I'm working with these really complicated problems because as much as we want it to be about the technology of identity, it always comes back down to people and politics and process and governance and all these things that aren't actually technical. And my job is to come in and to try and help the technical people move their stuff forward, however it needs to be done. Sometimes it means that I'm like the editorial oversight. Sometimes it means I'm actually holding the pen and writing stuff. Sometimes it means I'm a facilitator. Sometimes it means I'm managing all the groups that are going on. It's like, okay, what do you actually need to do stuff? And that is what Spherical Cow does. And that's just me. It's a one-person LLC, so it keeps me on my toes.
Yeah, no kidding. And so you work with ID Pro. I know that you worked on the body of knowledge and you continue to work on that. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your inner linkage with ID Pro and some of the things that you've worked on?
So I've actually been working with ID Pro since 2019, back when having a body of knowledge was still kind of a shiny glint in their eye. They didn't have one, but they knew they wanted it. And so that was right around the time where I was wrapping up being RFC series editor for the IETF. So the RFC series is kind of foundational to how the internet functions. And for 8 years, I was their editor to make sure that, executive oversight for the process for publishing those particular standards and informational documents. And when I heard that ID Pro was forming, I was a founding member, and then it was like, oh, and you want to do this body of knowledge? That's great. How are you going to do it? And they're like, we're not sure. And I said, wait, okay, here's what you need to do. Step 1, hire me. Step 2, let's build a process together. And that's really how it all started long ago.
I can imagine that library sign went out like the bat signal, and you're like, my people need me.
Almost exactly that. Yes, almost exactly that.
Yeah, does the body of knowledge have a Dewey Decimal System?
No, but it should. Dewey Decimal System is really just a hard done to thing. People make fun of it, and yet it's so very smart. Unlike the Library of Congress system, which is just, I'm sorry, those people, they had this great big building full of books, and they just said, stick labels on them based on what room they're in, and we'll call it good.
Well, there you go. Anyway, that idea, that'll be my contribution to ID Pro for the day. But ID Pro, it's had such momentum over the last couple of years and seems to be growing exponentially every year. Jeff and I are big fans, as we said, and we've had Ian Glazer and Sarah Cicchetti and Andy Hindle on with us in past episodes. And we've talked a lot about what is ID Pro doing? But it's been more kind of the strategy of what is ID Pro doing and where's it heading? And it seems like you're a person who's, making these things actually happen. So I'd like to kind of pose some of these things to you and how they're happening. So if you don't mind, I'll just kind of throw out a few things that are nascent to ID Pro and you can kind of talk about the how. So the first one that comes to mind is the CID Pro certification.
Mm-hmm. That was a lot of fun to put together. I was in on the ground floor of that as well. And that started very much with Sarah, it was a vision for Sarah that she really wanted to have some kind of certification for identity practitioners. We started talking to Kevin Streeter at Forge Rock. He's the VP of Forge Rock University and heavily involved in certification programs and how you build them and how you design them. And he and I and Sarah and a handful of others sat down and said, okay, if you're going to do this, here's how you do it right. Step one, build a blueprint. What exactly do you expect people to know in order to be considered a 2-year-old? That was our target, is we want a 2-year-old identity practitioner be able to pass this exam. So what kinds of things do we think are what we would expect a 2-year-old to know? And from there, that builds out the blueprint. Once you have the blueprint...
For clarification, you're not talking about a 2-year-old toddler. You're talking about someone who's spent 2 years in this field. Gotcha.
Yeah,
Excellent.
2 years in the field, but it was a 2-year-old. It worked. From there, it was, okay, now that we have a blueprint, we need to actually get the people who know this stuff. We want identity practitioners to build this exam, because who better to form the questions and answers than the people who live this every day. And so there was a committee that came together and started putting together the questions. And there was consultants involved who their job was teaching us how to build a test question. Because as it turns out, that's a fascinating subject area of specialty on its own. And they helped us with that to make sure that the questions were actually good questions for an exam. Then once that was done, we've got, I think, 2 or 3 different versions of the exam so that not everyone is seeing the same thing. Eventually, probably within the next year or 2, we're going to refresh those questions. If this becomes really popular, the glint in my eye is to say, all right, well, that's the foundational exam. But I want one that once you've got that foundational exam, I want an intermediate exam. I want an advanced exam. I want an exam that says, okay, if your area of specialty is actually research and education, what makes the IAM in that sector unique? That happens to be my background, so I know good and well there's a lot of unique things about it. But maybe then another one for fintech, another one for gaming, another one for IAM. You know, there's ways to turn this into specialty certifications that really speak to what someone in that sector should know, should aim for. We're not anywhere near there yet, but that's my goal.
Jeff, you were involved in coming up with questions.
I got one question.
You got one question.
One question on one of the 3 exams, and that's it. I can attest to the process. It is definitely not as simple as just writing a bunch of questions and then sticking them in the hat. There were long, thoughtful meetings and a long process to get the first version of the exam out, and I got one. So I'll take that.
I can tell that people really care who are involved with ID Pro. You're not going to slip in a question without it being debated.
Every question was debated.
Look at the Slack channel, and that's the next one that I wanted to ask you about, Heather, was, you know, what goes into having the Slack channel. Maybe it's just we turn on the Slack channel and everybody showed up. But, I mean, that thing is awesome. And then when you read some of the responses, it's like, you know, there's this rabbit hole concept on Netflix or YouTube where you just start. Well, for me, if I go away from the Slack channel and I connect for the first time in a couple of weeks, it's like rabbit hole city, and you start going down these different thread avenues. And so, do you have any additional insights on the Slack channel, Heather? Because we always tell people that's one of the biggest benefits of being an ID Pro.
Absolutely, it's community building and it's practically free consulting, right? It's the sitting at the water cooler with, 600 or 700 of your closest identity buddies where you're like, hey, did this work for you? Because, man, it was giving me grief. And you can ask that question or complain about this thing. And there will be people all over the world who are willing to chime in. I agree. It's absolutely our best resource. And it's not all geek all the time. I happen to know that there's like one channel called Pit Boss for people who like smoke and barbecue.
I didn't know that channel exists. I like the general one that just kind of goes off the rails sometimes. Body of knowledge. I mean, that's such a big topic. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was with the body of knowledge, do you feel like you're taking on some of these like really deep philosophical areas of identity, or is it pretty much staying on the rails?
So one of the things about ID Pro is not a standards setting organization. We're not even trying to be a standards setting organization. We're not trying to break new ground. We're not trying to say this is the one true way of doing a thing. We're trying to capture what the industry has agreed is, yes, this seems to be the right way to do things. The most obvious way that is expressed is we have, one of the things I require of all my authors is that their article have a terminology section, because they're going to use words, and I want it to be very clear how were those used words in that context, because it's going to differ from one article to the next because our industry is not mature enough to have that stabilized. I take all of those and put them in a consolidated terminology document so that you can see the 4 different ways that authentication has been defined. And then you can see where it was defined that way to get some sense of the context for all of that. So it's again, I would say we're on the rails because we're not trying to do brave new things. We're literally trying to get reasonable arms around an industry of practice.
Well, I think collecting all that information is super helpful to talk through and say, okay, where do we find information? Where can I go to for answers? I think the intent of the body of knowledge and the CID Pro exams were, if you read the body of knowledge, that should be all the studying that you need to do for the CID Pro exam.
That is also a goal. It is a goal, okay. But it's not there yet. Okay. It's not that complete. As it turns out, people are kind of nervous about writing.
Yeah, well, it's intimidating, especially if it's not something you've done before. Mm-hmm. Plus, now you're standing in front of hundreds, thousands, right, of your IAM brethren and sisters and all that other stuff, right? How do you get started contributing? Because you mentioned that you've got some requirements for people, right?
Yep.
Do I need to have a certain background? Can I just speak it into my iPhone Notes app and someone will help me format that?
So the most successful, for the people who have done this most successfully, what they usually do is start with that question. They reach out to me and say, wait, how do I do this? And I hop on a quick call and say, for one thing, I'm ecstatic when people reach out to me with that, because I love talking people through learning how to write and what topics. But from there, we just chat about, well, what do you want to write about? What do you feel passionate enough that you want to put together? And then I help them create an outline, because my brain definitely works on outlines. People who write streams of consciousness are usually better for blog posts. There's nothing wrong with blog posts. Trust me, we need those too. But for the body of knowledge, where it's trying to be a little bit more structured no, I need you to introduce the topic. I need you to be prepared to have a terminology. I need you to have a body that sort of builds your case such that if you were just looking at a table of contents, you would be able to read the story of what you're trying to tell somebody and then have a conclusion. And as we chat about that, we get a working document started. They go off and do their thing. I nag them periodically because that's 90% of what I do for a living is nag people. And then once it's done to our satisfaction, they submit it, and I start getting peer reviewers to actually review the document, offer feedback. These aren't blind peer reviews. The author will know who did the review, because it's so often, 9 times out of 10, generates a conversation to everybody's benefit. And it goes from there.
Are there specific topics that you find are either more difficult to write for or are missing? I think we mentioned that the body of knowledge is not yet complete right now, and maybe it never will be because things are always changing.
Sure.
But is there like a certain area where it's like, hey, let's use the power of this podcast to get the word out. Hey, we're looking for knowledge articles in this specific topic or domain.
So I have a GitHub repository. It's github.com/idpros with an S at the end. And one of the repositories in there is BOK-TOC, the Body of Knowledge Table of Contents. If I was queen of the universe, which I'm not, but if I were, that's the table of contents that I would want if we printed out all the articles together. Here is what a complete volume 1 of the Body of Knowledge would look like.
So why use GitHub for that style of, collaboration?
I'm using GitHub because it was frankly the easiest way It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but we wanted people to be able to talk about the articles. But where do you do that? Where do you maintain that? How do you actually manage we don't have a wiki, right? So we wouldn't put them on a wiki. Where do you put a place for people to chat just about these things? And so GitHub seemed to be a much better way for people to either put issues in and say, I think it's missing something. It gives me a really good trail when it's time to refresh the articles, which we try and do periodically, to just go back to the issue list and say, all right, what did people say again that we really wanted in here? The Slack won't work for that. For one thing, we have too many members to be able to afford paying for a Slack instance that keeps things longer than 90 days. And I do not want the body of knowledge to be only what I personally, me, Heather, knows, such that if I won the lottery, which I don't play, but this is about like me being queen of the universe and I moved to Tahiti, someone else needs to come in and be able to see, well, where are we? Where did we leave this article? What questions were still open about it? So GitHub seemed to be like the best fit of what was available.
Gotcha. Well, maybe if someone from Slack is listening, maybe they'd be willing to sponsor some licenses so that ID Pro can continue its amazing mission. There, soapbox off.
So Heather, you're pretty deeply entrenched in the standards world, right? And actually, I think we would have met sooner. I queued up to meet you at one of your Identiverse talks. And when I say queue, it was a long queue. It was moving very slowly. Like you're still talking to the same person for like 5 minutes. I was like, I'll meet Heather next time. But now we know each other. Now we're good friends. But speaking before you was Justin Richer. He was on the show a few episodes back. And he made the point that the goal of a standard is interoperability. So I think that would make them hard to write. Is that correct?
In a way, I would say it makes them hard to come to consensus on. And I guess you could say that anyone can write this stuff down and then say, if you want to interoperate, here you go. Here's the rules, how you do it. The trick comes when then you say, okay, but I really want this to live. I want this to be a thing that people actually use and not just me tossing out my thoughts into the universe and saying, my way or the highway. Consensus building to me is absolutely the hardest part of standards development.
So what attracted you to get involved in standards writing? What generally attracts people? I'll facetiously or tongue-in-cheek say this is boring stuff, right?
So this is going to, I hope this doesn't sound preachy, but this is how my brain works. I have been an independent for close to 12 years. And one of the things, and I've worked with a coach, because one of the things that you have to do when you go independent is if you want someone coaching you, which you would normally be your manager or your HR, someone in your company, you hire a coach, which I did. And one of the first things she and I worked out was, well, why am I doing this? Why am I going to be an independent? What am I trying to accomplish with my life and my career? And the answer is, I want to make the internet better. And unpacking that, I can't write code. I mean, if it's not SendMail rule sets in M4, it's not working for me. I can't actually do it. I think SendMail and M4 broke my brain, but that's another topic, right? Okay, I can't code. I'm not a visionary. I'm not an architect. I can't look at a system and say, oh, it could do the following. No, none of that is me. Okay, so if you can't code and you can't have an architectural vision for how it's going to work, so tell me again, how do you think you can make the internet better? Well, as it turns out, there's a big long list. Engineers are not the most organized people I've ever met. And so I want to make the internet better. So I am really attracted to those spaces that don't have someone like me to come in and actually say, all right, I'm passionate about what you're doing, but I can't do what you're doing. So let me do what I can do to make your life better and make you have more progress.
So a lot of times you're working with the engineers, the technical folks who they have all the information in their head. They just can't put it on paper, and you guide them through that process, or at least extract the information that you need to write a standard. And I'm wondering, what's the difference between a good and a bad standard? And I'm wondering if it's how many people adopt it. Like, is XML the greatest standard of all time, or the ASCII standard, or or SAML for us? Are those the best standards because the most people were able to put them into usage?
Hey, Jim, I think maybe we need like a standards hall of fame or something.
Oh, that would be fun. We should have that. To me, the best standard is the one that's unambiguous. Yes or no, people, having people adopt it is, of course, very important, but it's not really a great standard until people can look at it and go say, yes, I actually absolutely understand what this is trying to say. I was editing if this hasn't been published as a standard yet, it's still in a draft stage. And they kept using the word trust. And I said, okay, you know what? I'm not actually sure I know what you mean. Are you talking technical trust, which is like mathematically provable? Are you talking contractual trust in terms of there's actually written agreements about how things will happen? What does this mean? And going into it and being able to, it's really hard for experts to do this, by the way, because he knew exactly what he was talking about. It just changed from one paragraph to the next, which didn't help anybody else. But being able to up level a little bit and think about, is this clear to someone who isn't me or someone who isn't been in this small working group?
I think those common terms are sometimes the ones that we throw around and say all the time are the hardest ones to define. What do you mean identity?
Yep.
So if someone out there is listening and they are interested in getting involved or maybe building a career out of standards, what do they need to get started? Do they need to have like a degree in English? Or actually, this is another question I'm going to follow up with. All right, so there's the first question. The second question is, are all the standards written in English, or are some of them written in other languages? And there's a whole industry around.
Yeah. Well, that depends on what standards organization you're talking to, right? There's a lot of different standards organizations in the world. Some are treaty-based and nation-based, somehow backed by law. And those will be in whatever language or languages are appropriate to the laws and treaties that form that particular standards organization. So ISO publishes in, I want to say, 7 different languages, possibly more, right? Etsy will publish in a variety. You go to, it's like going to, if you ever gone to look for, this isn't a technical standard, but the concept still applies, actually look for the text of the GDPR. You have to select from like 24 different languages to what works for you so that you can actually read the regulation. Now, in more industry-based standards organizations like the IETF or the OpenID Foundation or the Decentralized Identity Foundation, they will generally write in only one language. And that will be whatever language, where they formed. And that's mostly because they can't afford anything else. Translation requires resources, and they often can't afford to do that. The ID Pro Body of Knowledge has a grant from Amazon. Thank you, Amazon, to do a limited translation of the Body of Knowledge into Spanish. So all the articles up through the release of issue 10 are in the process of being translated. Several of them have already been published, so that if you want to read them in Spanish, you absolutely can. And they've been reviewed by subject matter experts to make sure that the translation is solid. But that was not inexpensive. We needed the grant to do that, and we can't maintain it. So issue 11 has come out since the grant was awarded. We have issue 12 coming out later this year, and those won't get translated. We don't have a translation into French. It would be really great if we did, but all of that requires resources we don't have.
Yeah, that's not a standard translation, right? That's a technical translation. You have to have somebody who knows how those words translate into the other languages.
A little bit of both.
Context. It's not just the word.
I think it helped with the ID Pro project because we had that consolidated terminology document. And I said, okay, before you translate anything else, translate this. Let me get this reviewed by the subject matter experts, give it back to you, and now you have a reference for the most difficult terms that you're going to find in the documents. I think that was really helpful.
That's very cool. So I know you had mentioned in the past one of the important things for getting started is having support from your management. And I'm wondering, is that I think this was part of your Identiverse talk, like get the support for your management, and then a lot of the management, maybe rightfully so, are going to ask, okay, what's in it for us, right? Because we're going to spend all this money. How's this coming back to the company?
Yeah, that is the biggest problem of, people who really want to get involved in this is making that case, because any manager worth their salt is going to ask, okay, how much time is this going to take and for how long? What are the outputs? How are you going to measure this and measure the value to the company and things like that? Unless you're working for a company that says 10% of your time you can do whatever you want to that's relevant to us and you can figure it out, right? Unless you work for a company like that, you actually have to be thinking ahead to make an argument of why you should be allowed to do this and why you're allowed to do it long term, because there are no quick wins. There are no quick wins in standards development.
You don't have any thought, because I want to bring the conversation back to ID Pro if we could for a minute. We talked about how with the CID Pro, with the Slack channel, with the body of knowledge. One other area was, just the blogs that come out. And I'd like to know a little bit more, if you could help us, how people should approach or navigate or, use the blogs. But I also wanted to ask you about a blog that you've recently wrote on government-issued digital credentials and privacy. Actually, that was one of the main drivers to reach out to you, to have you on here. So you can give us kind of a summary on that, because I think it's such a hot topic that people want to dive into.
Sure. Well, for blogs in general on the ID Pro site, think of them as the op-ed pieces. Those are the informed opinion pieces that people publish. And there's an editorial committee that looks them over so that they're not, egregiously vendor-driven or flat out wrong, but still, they're primarily op-ed pieces. The one that I put together was a blog post about a paper that I wrote. The paper is called Government-Issued Digital Credentials in the Privacy Landscape. It's not a short paper. It's about 70 pages, and yet I still considered it an overview of the landscape. If you want to know more about any topic within the paper, there's about 130 citations. Lots of things for people to be able to just drill down on. The paper is structured such that it's kind of divided into, okay, so there's governments issuing credentials. That's, part of the constrained scope. What governments are you talking about? Give us some examples of what different governments are doing. And so we looked at Aadhaar, which is in India, which is the biggest one. I mean, they have issued more digital credentials to their population and residents than anybody else. Singapore, which is probably the most high-tech ubiquitous you're going to find. Nigeria, which is the biggest one in Africa. We looked at sort of the EU in general, because the EU is a fascinating beast. And then we looked at Italy. We didn't look at Estonia, because everybody looks at Estonia, and I wanted to look at something that was a little more challenging. And Italy is doing so much, and yet they've got some really interesting challenges of an older population, not as many mobile phones. So how is that going to work for them? So cover that. And then, we couldn't escape writing about the U.S., but the U.S., as much as we say it is a country, it's more like this loose federation of states, and every state was doing something a little bit different. So I picked a handful of states to just show some of the diversity of what the U.S. is doing in terms of digital credentials. So that's fine. That was great. That gives you that start. But then it's like, okay, well, what standards guide these credentials? There's privacy frameworks, there's technical standards, what actually informs the space. And so did a little bit of a write-up about some of what's out there. Certainly not complete, but it gives you a sense for the biggest things, I think. There's a section on, okay, you've got this model of how it's looking in several different countries. You've got standards that exist, standards and regulations that exist. So what more could you possibly need? Well, as it turns out, I have a list. And there is a section on gaps of, okay, well, where are things missing? Because there's always going to be things missing. Regulation and standards are never all that closely tied together. And there's actually sometimes this big gaping chasm between the two, and other times there's just so friction, like there's a little San Andreas fault going on where they're just rubbing against each other and we're waiting for an earthquake where things are all destroyed. So we talked about that a little bit. And then we wrapped up with, okay, this has all been wonderful and fascinating, but are there things coming down the pipe that we aren't thinking about, that we're not really having all the discussions yet that we need to, and how the governments are going to have to think about it with their credentials, and how privacy is actually going to function in the brave new world. So things like digital warfare. When you make your digital credential infrastructure a core part of how your country does business, it becomes a target in war. And are you prepared for that? Have you thought about that? Are you still posting stuff to the lowest bidder to secure your identity systems? Thinking these things through were put on the list of areas to watch. And that is what the blog post was about.
I mean, that's a lot. It's a short read. It's an easy read right now. There's a lot to cover through that. I had a question about, you talked about some of the standards development stuff that was going on. What is the target for a standard? Should it be 100%? This standard should apply to 100% of the target population. This is a standard for most of the people to adhere to? Because I feel like this is an area where we start getting into like the digital divide, the haves and the have-nots, whatever that have or have not might be. And if you're trying to develop standards, I would imagine that it's a lot easier to say, well, let's just make an assumption that everybody has X, which may not be right.
Oh, it's certainly easier. And that does in fact happen, because you're now having to balance, do you want to make progress or do you want to capture every possible use case? It may even be a valid use case, but every possible use case, you're never going to finish. You're never going to finish. The other problem that standards development has that doesn't often get mentioned is, of course, so you've got an organization like the IETF, and they are working on developing standards that will make the internet work. That's a good, worthy goal. I like that goal. I support that goal. The internet doesn't really recognize geopolitical boundaries. And so you've got the GDPR in Europe. You have a mishmash of privacy law in the US. You've got completely different laws in Singapore. You've got so many different regulations of what they're requiring of countries that the underlying infrastructure has to support all of it. Right. And that's a really, really hard thing to do.
How do you feel about generative AI? As a writer, I find things like ChatGPT and Bard, and I can't remember what Meta's is called at this moment, but I'm a fan of it, but I get curious when I talk to people who are actual writers and can actually, do a good job with that versus me, where that is not my strength, and I'm looking for tips or ways to improve that.
Oh, sure.
How do you see, those types of things? Is it cheating?
No, not at all. Not at all. But it's not cheating, but nor is it a guaranteed win, right?
Right.
Where's the source of information for these generative AI models? Right, wrong, or indifferent, it's generally stuff that's on the internet. Mm-hmm. And tell me how correct stuff is on the internet, right? You're going to get stuff that's really, really right, really, really wrong. And the problem with the generative AI models is they present that information assertively, confidently. Sounds reasonable. Why not? So the problem I have with generative AI is not as much with the AI as it is with people accepting it without question. But then I feel that way about the internet too. So
yeah, well, I mean, it is definitely, I think this is where people still need to put their thinking caps on and say, okay, can I trust this information? Which is certainly,
right.
A big issue, because what if you poison the model itself, right? And it's no different than, I don't know, art poisoning or other types of attacks, right? Where you're heading to the source of truth, and it's a cascading effect down from there. I like to use it for benign stuff. I think I've shared on this podcast before, I'm in charge of making sure timesheets get submitted on time. As a consulting business, is very important. So there's an email I send out. Today, I used it to generate a scene from the Barbie movie, because that's topical, about the situation with Ken forgetting to submit his timesheet or something like that. And then to spice it up, I used generative AI to create an image of that sort of scene. And the text was decent, I thought. If you didn't know any better, it would probably pass, a novice kind of scan of it. The image, not so much.
Right.
It was downright horrifying in some cases, for some of the things that came out of it. But I do find it interesting as a tool or a crutch to kind of get started with something and have an idea, which I think is going to be a huge advantage for people. And maybe that might help people with some of the things that we've been talking about here is, do you embrace that sort of approach to say, hey, I've got an idea. Let me at least start it here. And then, of course, let's polish it and make sure, one, that it's factually accurate, but it also meets the style and guidelines and things like that.
Yeah. A friend of mine actually did that. He went to ChatGPT and said, write an internet draft on digital identity and why it's important. And then, okay, now write an internet draft on digital identity and why it is not important, right? And just getting both those models. And they were both hilarious and yet not poorly done. For me, I'm more likely to say, okay, I really need to write some blog posts and I'm just not feeling it. Okay, give me 10 titles,
seed topics and
10 topical titles about Federation or Passkey or Federation versus Passkey or something. And from there, that's usually enough to kickstart me to go. Or I may say, all right, and I've done this many times. Here's the abstract for a body of knowledge article. Give me something to start with on how I want to create a LinkedIn post. Because since February, I've actually been solely responsible for ID Pro's social media. So, which has been really character building.
Yeah, I'll bet. Okay, well, we've had a great conversation. And by my watch, it just turned 5 o'clock, which means it's drinking time. We're going to go ahead and wrap up.
That's the first time Jeff has ever said that in his entire life.
It is. It's 5 o'clock somewhere. Ha, ha, ha. Normally, for our lighter notes to end our conversations, we kind of pick like a topic or a stupid question or something just to kind of have fun at the end. And this is the first time we're trying something of this nature. We're actually going to do a Scotch whiskey tasting, and Heather is going to be our guide. This is something that we've been working on behind the scenes for weeks, I think, at this point, trying to procure a specific bottle, Bunnahabhain 12-year Scotch whiskey, to be accurate, I guess. I was able to find a bottle in the Asheville, North Carolina area, which is where I'm at. Jim, were you able to find a bottle?
I was not. I was able to find a Scotch whiskey, but not of the Bunnahabhain. So I got the Glenlivet 12. Same number of years, so I'm assuming it's going to taste exactly the same.
Oh, I'm sure that's how that works, right? Heather just rolled her eyes back, and I think if you could send a shock through the internet, it probably would have hit your ears by now, Jim.
Hey, but that's what I'm good at.
You do like to stir the pot. All right, fun. So I've got this bottle here, Bunnahabhain 12. I've never had before. I'm not really a Scotch whiskey drinker really at all, but I do like to taste things and try things out for the first time. So, Heather, why don't you walk us through here? What am I looking at? What should I be expecting? And then we'll taste it.
What have I dragged you into?
Yeah.
I think that would be a pretty good way to put it. Yeah. Okay. So, I do like a good Scotch. I am used to drinking single barrel, single malt Scotches, which basically means the whiskey came from a single distillery and all from the same barrel. Those are usually higher alcohol by volumes. And that can be a little aggressive on the palate because that's when like your nostril hairs light on fire. And smoke comes out your ears and then you can't breathe for a little bit because your whole system goes, what did you just do? So
some people like that.
No, I didn't think starting there would be a good idea.
Yeah.
So instead I started both you and Jim, with something that was a bit more approachable. This is not a peated Scotch, because people who like peated Scotches will drink non-peated Scotches. People who do not like, you can only go in one direction. Everybody will drink non-peated Scotches and only.
So what does peated mean?
Basically, that means that when they were cooking the barley, they basically burnt stuff around it and had it just absorb smoke and.
You know what peat is? So it's like a moss.
Like peat moss, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Like in Ireland, I guess in Scotland, it's very common. So they burn in their house for heat and cook their food over and stuff like that.
But one of the fascinating things about peat is depending on where you are, and again, I know the Scotch whiskey's better, right? The peat that you're going to get near the coast is not the same as the peat you're going to get, say, in the Highlands or something. One's going to have, it's going to be a little more salty, you know, that sort of coastal flavor to it. The other one's going to be more like heathery. It's just a different flavor to it. I don't think either of them are bad. I'll drink all of it. Though I will be very specific as to what order I will drink it in. You know, you do not start the evening with a Lefroy peated Scotch, because then your palate is completely destroyed for anything else after that. That's something that you have after steak.
Why don't you start there? When you say palate destroyed, explain that.
The flavor is so strong and so overwhelming that if you try and taste anything more mild after that, you're not going to be able to taste it well. The flavors just won't work.
I know one thing I've observed, because I'm not really a wine drinker either, but people, you know, they smell the cork, then they swirl it around in their wine glass and see if it has legs.
Yeah.
Is there such a protocol with Scotch, or do you just pour it in and start enjoying?
So, yes-ish. I mean, at the end of the day, you do what you want to do to enjoy what you're drinking. That's the one true rule is do what you want to do to enjoy what you're drinking. If that means putting ice in it, then put ice in it. If that means, you know, putting a drop of water in it, put a drop of water in it. You know, it's whatever works for you. Now, that said, there's a couple things that I would say very much differ between drinking wine and drinking whiskey. So let's say I'm going to pick up a different glass. Let's say that this was a glass of wine. It's not a glass of water, but it's got a nice wide open top, and you might want to smell it by sticking your nose right over it and taking a good deep breath. Don't do that with whiskey. Just, I mean, move it away, move it around, but don't just shove your head in the glass, because then the alcohol fumes will, you know, cause your face kind of to melt off. It's a little harsh. Another point to remember is, you know, like those fumes that you're smelling, you know, they're actually a little heavier than air. So another thing some people do is they tilt the glasses like that and smell that way. And you'll find it actually does smell different depending on.
So you have it like at a 45-degree angle.
How you smell it.
All right, I'm going to open this bottle up, and you're going to tell me what I'm going to do. So I'm going to try and make this audio podcast friendly. You're going to hear it. Ooh, hear that? Right, and now here's the glass. Let me
chug, chug, chug,
chug, chug, chug. All right. So now I've got
if
it.
You
in
do
my
the bitter
little
beer
rocks
face,
here.
nobody's going to know. But go ahead.
That's great. All right, I'm going to taste it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now,
I feel it in my nose.
Was that hot? Like, did that burn a little bit?
A little bit.
Okay.
Not bad. Not as bad as I was expecting.
No, it shouldn't. I didn't get you one that would do that.
Thank you.
Next time we'll come with a wider variety. But one thing you might do is, do you have any water?
I do.
Okay, put like a drop or two of water in there. Try it again.
All right. Swirl it around a little bit. Oh yeah, it definitely cuts it for sure.
Yeah. And that's a perfectly valid life choice. It actually does a bunch of other things, chemically speaking, in terms of how the water messes with some of the bonds in the whiskey. But if you want to know more about that, Google it.
Google it.
It's complicated. It's cool, but it's complicated.
So what should I be tasting? Because I struggle with, so my wife is very much into spirits and wine, and she has a great nose and palate and can tell you everything about everything, right? And I'm like, for me, it's like, it tastes like red wine, or, it tastes like white wine.
Yep.
What am I tasting as part of this Bunnahabhain?
So,
or what should I be getting, I should say?
Okay, but a little bit of that is actually going to come down to genetics and what you're sensitive to. So my sweetheart, for example, is extraordinarily sensitive to bitter flavors. He finds them overwhelming, where I find them not particularly overwhelming and actually kind of like them. I am very sensitive to vanillins, the thing that makes dust taste like vanilla. So for me, This has a lot of vanilla flavors in it. Now, if you actually go look at a description of this particular scotch, it will tell you that, yep, it's going to have some vanilla flavors to it. It's going to be a little bit more floral, a little sweeter, which is why I think it's a good starter scotch if that's something you want to get into. The Glenlivet that Jim has a similar flavor profile, which is, since he couldn't get the Bunnahabhain, I suggested he try that one because at least the flavor profile should be similar to what we have. Of course, now you two actually have to like physically get together and compare and see how far off these are in terms of flavor, because I really want to know.
Well, Jeff hasn't checked a bag in like 25 years, so I don't think he'll be able to get that bottle. We'll have to...
I travel light. Got to be ready to go whenever.
Yeah. Well, so I have a question. Okay, so I got the Glenlivet 12. You got a 12. I also saw they had the Glenlivet like 18. I think it was $200. I think they had a 25, and it was like $700. Is it that exponentially better, or what is it that you're paying for?
It's that exponentially rarer.
Rarer.
Because, I mean, think about it. They have to hold those barrels aside for longer and longer and longer. And, you know, they're gonna cut, you know, at 12 years, they're going to take, I'm pulling numbers out of the air, half the barrels. So now you've got half the barrels left that you're going to have to decide how many do you want to take for your 18 year? How many do you want to take for your 24 year? Do you want to save 3 barrels to be, you know, absolutely over the top and save them for a 50 year?
Does aging it that long do anything, or is there a point where it doesn't matter anymore?
So my personal opinion, and what I have talked to some of the distillers agree with this one, is that once you get over like the 24, 25 year mark, you're not actually tasting the character of the whiskey anymore. You're tasting the barrel that the whiskey was in. It's really the only flavors that are left are the barrel flavors. Now, those may be very tasty barrel flavors, right? Live like you want to live, if that's what you like, and you have the pocketbook to handle the fact that you're now getting something that was increasingly rare and took up rent for a really long time and just wouldn't move out of its parents' house, that's fine. I have seen on the market I think there's a Bunnahabhain 40. I would never buy such a thing myself, but it is out there. You could buy it if you had more money than sense.
So, Heather, if you bought the Bunnahabhain 40 and kept it in your cellar for 10 years, would it be the Bunnahabhain 50?
Nope. Unlike wine continues to age in a bottle. Whiskey does not. Once it's, because it's the contact with the barrel that's actually the aging component. Once it's out of the barrel, it's done. It's not going to do anything else, really, sitting in a bottle by itself.
All right. My turn for taste test.
Go for it, Jim. Very podcast friendly, watching someone drink.
Yeah, that's good. I've had this before, I think.
I've opened this bottle now. Mm-hmm. How long is this bottle going to be good for? Will it be a point where oxidation or something like that might get into it?
So it does kind of depend. I mean, right now you've opened it. You've had maybe 2 fingers worth of scotch out of it. You know what? That bottle is going to be just fine for a long time. Let's say that you enjoyed it and you got it to be about, 3/4 of the way done. At that point, there's enough air in there that, yeah, the oxidation will start impacting the flavor a little bit. But how long that takes in no small part depends on how much you've drank already.
So there's a chance I could take this Bunnahabhain 12 and turn it into a Bunnahabhain 20 by the time I'm done with it. And I will have gotten extreme value out of it.
You could take the Bunnahabhain 12 and keep drinking 12 for another 8 years. Yes, this is true.
Right. Okay.
But it's still just going to be a 12.
Are you familiar with Coravins in the wine world? She's packing, folks. She's got her Coravin machine right there. So we use this in our house too. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically a needle that gets injected into the cork of a wine bottle. And the concept is replace what has been lost within the bottle itself with an inert gas, usually like argon, because it will not affect the contents of the bottle itself. Mm-hmm. And so we use it in our house. My wife is a big fan of it. I think we're on our 3rd Coravin at this point. We've used it so much. So, and they're not cheap, but is there something similar for something like this, or it doesn't matter because it really is not the same type of concept?
I'm not aware of anything similar to that. I'm not
Should
aware
there
of a
be?
need for anything similar to
Okay.
that.
Well, there goes my $1 million idea. I guess we'll keep doing identity podcasts.
Drink it faster than that.
Drink it faster.
Don't
right?
let it sit around for 8 years.
Well, the Corbin's great if you have a really nice bottle of wine where oxidation is definitely a threat, especially once you open up that wine. That's why a lot of times people want to let
go
it
bad
breathe
in a
and so
week,
forth.
right?
Yeah. And so being able to have a nice bottle of wine, or have a nice glass of wine without having to, take the entire bottle at once, or, if you've got a good collection, whatever, I find it interesting. But this is very cool. So I will be honest, I'm not much of a drinker, but this is better than I thought it would be.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know. I hope you take that in the compliment that I am trying to give it into.
I'm glad I did not poison you and
No, I
turn you
appreciate
off
that too.
to ever drinking with me again.
Yeah, no. I will be happy to cheers with you at some point in the future. Hopefully in a less awkward semicircle, standing around with either, I don't know, Vittorio or others, Ian, et cetera, as we're kind of congregating in identity hallways.
I have one more question. So I'm wondering if you have an opinion on Scotch with cigars. I don't really partake in either very often, but it seems like people who smoke cigars like to drink Scotch and play golf.
I have heard that. I have also observed that. I am not one of those people because for people who don't know me and who are just listening on the podcast, I have very long hair. One thing that hair does is absorb smells. And so if I was being around someone who was smoking or smoking something myself, my hair would just absorb that, and I would smell like that for a while until I managed to get into a shower. And that's just not a thing that works for me. So no.
I hear you. I worked at Chili's for a long time. I'd come home smelling like fajitas. You it's almost like you get used to the smell, and you can't smell it yourself.
Yeah.
So somebody has to tell you, boy, something smells delicious in here. It smells like fajitas. Like, oh, okay, I better take a shower or something. All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Heather, thank you so much for sharing time with us today and kind of talking through all the stuff you're working on, your many, many hats. We're going to have, this might be a record for number of show notes, links in our show notes, that sort of thing. I'm going to have a connection information for Heather on LinkedIn. You can learn more about Spherical Cow Consulting at sphericalcowconsulting.com. What is a spherical cow? Well, I will conveniently place the wiki article right below that link. Also a link to the article that we referenced here, the blog article that Heather wrote around government-issued digital credentials and privacy. Also the ID Pro body of knowledge, the ID Pro GitHub, all of our various discount codes for Octane, for Identity Week America, and definitely for the Authenticate conference, as well as links for people connect and send pictures of Whoppers candy to Jim, which I tweeted that this morning as part of our weekly rollout this morning. So hopefully you'll start to get those into your LinkedIn. But if you haven't, I definitely welcome you. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. We're on the web, idacpodcast.com, Twitter or X or whatever the heck it's called by the time you listen to this, IDAC at IDAC Podcasts, Mastodon at IDAC Podcast at infosec.exchange. Hit us up on LinkedIn. And don't forget to like, subscribe, all that cool stuff that helps us out, gets great guests like Heather and others to join us. And funds are very expensive, about to be very expensive, Scotch whiskey drinking habits that Heather has gotten us onto. So with that, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.